Hello, my name is Ann Luna. I'm a docent at the Santa Barbara Historical Museum, located downtown on the corner of Santa Barbara and De La Guerra Street. Today, I'll be doing a presentation about the activities that occurred in Santa Barbara during World War II. That's 1939 to 1945. So let me start the slide. Okay, here we have our first slide. It's an image of the Santa Barbara mission taken in 1943. As you can see in the corner here, there's a sign that says dim out. My image kind of covers it up, but you'll see it eventually. It says dim out. And why would we have a dim out during this time period? Well, of course, they had air raids in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor was bombed. So in the US mainland, they were afraid of air raids as well. So they had a program called Dim Out, where they would, at night, turn off all the lights, pull shades down, so that the enemy would not know where the government buildings were and other significant buildings were in the city. Our next slide is of the Santa Barbara Harbor, a little different than what we have today. This is before the marinas were built and before anything else is built. All we have is just the Naval Reserve Center. It was called the Naval Reserve Armory during the time period of the war. As you can see, there's a pier there. It's called the Navy Wharf. Now, the building was built in 1939 and then finished in 1942 after we became involved in the war. The Navy Pier was sold to, or leased to the Navy in 1942, and it was built to service the Navy ships that were in the Pacific. So why would you need a harbor, in fact, such a small harbor on the Pacific coast? Well, ships, especially Navy ships, are made of iron and metal. And when they're out at sea, they become magnetized with the chemicals in the water and also electrical things in the ship itself. So every so often, a ship has to come into port. And before they come into port, they have to be demagnetized. They call it degaussing. And basically, right before they come into port, they go through a magnetic field, electric magnetic field, to be demagnetized, and then they come into port. So why is that important? During World War II, they had mines that were sitting in the water, and they were set to react to, like magnets, to be attached to the ship and then explode the ship. Every time somebody went into port, they had to be degaussed as a protection for all their naval fleet. So this is another familiar sight, maybe not to you today because it's very different. This is La Playa Stadium, right below City College, where we would play football today. Back then, it was just a plain open field. It was a landfill that was caused by the building of the breakwaters. And during wartime, soldiers, Marines, they would practice arm-to-arm combat. And in fact, sometimes you might even see a tank coming across the grounds. Now here we have a tank in front of De La Guerra Plaza. So why would you need a tank in front of De La Guerra Plaza? There was nobody to fight there. Well, the main reason was a fundraising reason. During the war, to help pay for the war and soldiers and equipment, they would have bond drives. So they would show a piece of equipment that was being used by the military, and they wanted to show how they could pay for it by buying bonds. Many organizations used this method to pay for the war. They had community involvement by organizations making bandages that were sent out to the wounded soldiers in the field. We also supported the military by growing certain crops. We grew beans, like for GI beans. And GI, that's kind of a term we're kind of familiar with. GI means government issue, general issue, has a lot of meanings. But during the World War II, it became a symbol for the military men, GI Joes. In addition to supporting the military with other things, one kind of funny thing that we supported the military with was it's fat from the butcher shops. Fat was used to make explosive. The glycerin from the fat was used to make the explosive. Now, we had many organizations that were supporting the military. We had a lot of military here in Santa Barbara. Here was a place called the Canteen. It was a group of women who fed the soldiers 3 meals a day, talked to them, and kept them company. Since they were away from home, they needed to have someone to talk to and also help in their affairs while they were here in Santa Barbara. This organization was called the American Women's Volunteer Services. The canteen was at 413 State Street. Now it's just a restaurant, but back then it was a canteen. And the bar there was actually the bar from the Potter Hotel, which had burned down some time ago, but they salvaged the bar and used it as a counter there at the canteen. It opened on February 7th, 1942, and it went on until July 1942. In that time period, they served about 50,000 service people at the canteen. The 50,000th soldier was named Stephen Morales. And back in those days, they gave him a picture, gave him a St. Christopher medal, and basically it was a big deal for him to be the 50,000th soldier. Also, while they were here, they tried to give them some recreational activities to do. There were dances, there were many things that were there for recreation for the soldiers. Different hotels were commandeered. That means they were taken over by the military for use by them. We had the Miramar Hotel, the Biltmore Hotel, and the Marmonte, which is now the Hyatt. They were used as redistribution stations. Basically, they were here for R&R, rest and recreation, until they went out to their next duty station. The Cabrillo Pavilion was a check-in processing center for the military. There were welcome houses and employment guidance at different locations in Santa Barbara. And one of the things that's kind of odd is called the El Faro Club. That was a social club for the African Americans. While it may be interesting to note that while we had many soldiers in the military, it was still pretty segregated within the ranks there. So here we have a photo of downtown Santa Barbara on State Street. This is where the USO Club is. It's the United Services Organization. It's another organization to help the soldiers and their families during wartime, help them to communicate with their families, make sure the families were doing well, make sure that they had what they needed all around. Now, here's the street. This is probably in the 1940s here. And here's what it looks like today. I guess that looks kind of familiar right there. You see the Starbucks, and across the street is the, it shows Pinkberry, but now I think there's the Blue Mercury Spa is located there. And that's where the USO, United Services Organization, was located. They also did a lot of shows for them. Different comedians and stars would perform for them at different venues. So why were the soldiers coming here? That's kind of an interesting reason why so many were here. Well, we had a large hospital called HOF Hospital. It was located on State in Las Positas. It had covered about 58 acres up there. I think the only thing that remains from that time period is the McKenzie Park building. Now where the majority of the hospital buildings were is a big golf course, a municipal golf course. Now they opened the hospital, well, they began construction in 1940, December 1940, and then they opened on March 1st, 1941. They served about 27,000 servicemen there. It was named after a surgeon who served during early years as a military surgeon, Dr. John Van Rensselaer Hoff. He is an Army surgeon. So the hospital specialized in injuries involving the foot and the hand. They had a rehab center, and they had buses that would take them from the hotels they were staying at to the hospital. The peak year for the hospital was 1945. In 1 year, they admitted 641 patients. The total service personnel served were 27,000. They were treated at the hospital. Here's the view inside the bus. As you can tell, there were men and women service people. It was, during that time frame, to be patriotic, it was considered an honor to marry someone in the service. So men and women who served in the military were a catch for anyone. We also had an aerial field. located at the location of UCSB campus. At the outbreak of the war, they decided to start building the airfield there, the Marine base is built there. It began construction in May of 1942, and the first 139 Marines arrived on June 14th, 1942. And they started doing business on December 4th, 1942. Basically, their business was flying aircraft from this field. At the peak, it housed about 500 officers, 3,100 enlisted men and women, and 440 women Marines. There were a total of 24 squadrons that were at the base. Many of these people are now honored in that area. We have a memorial at the airport for World War II aviators that died, and it's at Vista Point at the airport. There were 49 aviators and 48 men and 1 woman that died during World War II in aviation accidents. At this time, they're naming some of the streets in that area after the aviators. So if you go down to the area near the campus, near the airport, you would see some of the names of these aviators. During this time, the women became very prominent in serving in the war. The United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve started in 1943. 1/3 of the women Marine reservists were in the aviation wing of the Marine Corps. In our area, Aviation Reserve Squadron number 2 was based in Santa Barbara. There were 21 squadrons during World War II. 2 local women that were in the squadron, not that squadron, but the Women's Air Force service pilots. They were Carol Britton Selfridge and Edna Modesti Davis. They were residents of Santa Barbara and 2 of the few women that served in the Women's Air Force service pilots. 200 women served in the program in our area. In March 8th, 2010, these women received a Congressional Gold Medal for their service during World War II. There's also a movie that was filmed in PBS called Fly Girls that covers some of the activities that the women did during World War II. Interesting to note, while they were veterans and they did fight and did their part in the war, many of them did not receive veterans benefits until much later in 1977 when they were granted veteran status. Another reason why we're had a big issues and big information that we shared during World War II is that we had an attack on the mainland. But before that, there were other attacks on different ships in the Pacific. December 23rd, 1941, the Montebello fuel tanker carrying about 100,000 gallons of crude oil was sunk 6 miles off of Cambria in 900 feet of water by a Japanese I-21 submarine. There were many sightings of different things about the Japanese in the area, which caused a lot of fear. Jack Hollister reported seeing Japanese fishing trawlers off the coast of Hollister Ranch near Giotto. And then on February 23rd, in 1942, Elwood Oil Fields was attacked by the Japanese submarine I-17 at 7:15 p.m. Here's a model of the submarine here. It was a Sentoku Class 1 Japanese submarine. It was later sunk in August 1943 off the coast of New Zealand with the loss of all hands on deck. Here's another schematic of the drawing. It actually carried 1 plane on top. And of course, Japan also had their own version of the incident. Here we have a postcard that was shared back in Japan of the shelling. It depicted the caption says, "Our submarine bombarding the coast of California." Of course, that was their version of the war and how successful they were in attacking the coast off of California. So what were they actually attacking? They were attacking the Elwood Oil Fields. The commander, the sub-commander, was Nishino Kozo. He's alleged to have actually worked in the area on a Japanese tanker taking on oil from Elwood in the 1930s. There's a story that he actually slipped and fell on a cactus and was laughed at by the rig workers. Some may say it was his revenge for that embarrassment, but we'll never know. The damage itself was not that great, about $500 to the platforms, and so not that extensive. I think the bigger damage was psychological, the fear of being attacked. The debris from the attack was used to build certain structures in Santa Barbara. There's a restaurant called Timbers. It's over there near Winchester Canyon. It's no longer called Timbers, but it's still standing. And they said they used some of the timbers and wood from the oil platforms and the pier that was there to build that particular structure. Again, the psychological fear was great. Executive Order 9066 was issued February 19th, 1942. Take note, it was before the attack on our Elwood area in Santa Barbara. This fear was already gathering because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Because of it, US citizens of Japanese descent were, Japanese heritage on the West Coast were considered to be enemies, and they were ordered to be to relocation camps. Now, there are about 120,000 Japanese that were ordered to be moved to relocation camps. Of these, 70,000 were US citizens. And Santa Barbara County had about 700 Japanese families. Now, out of the nearly 70,000 evacuees that were American, there were no charges filed against them. They lost all their liberty, they lost their land, they lost their homes. And even those that were first generation born here in the US, they also had to go to the camps. Altogether, in the military, there were 30,000 Japanese Americans that served in World War II in a segregated unit. These camps were located across the country. The one closest to us was in Manzanar. That's near Inyo County. It's actually near a city called Independence, which is kind of ironic. But basically, all the relocation camps were spread across the country. And at certain times, they could actually leave the camp if they could show they would not live along the coast. They would actually live somewhere inland. This is Manzanar, the relocation camp near Inyo County, near Independence. You can see Mount Williamson in the background. This was taken in 1942. Here's what it looked like inside the camps. One of our citizens here in Santa Barbara, he was actually in the camp at Gila River in Arizona. He was from Lompoc. His name was Kenji Ota. He went to the camp in Arizona. He met his wife there. He was the first generation born in the US, so he was allowed to relocate to a different city away from the coast. He moved to Philadelphia and then moved back to Santa Barbara with his wife. Eventually, they opened a dance studio, martial arts studio called Ota's Cultural School that was located in Goleta. After the war, many of the Japanese decided to go back to Japan. This is a photo of the Japanese leaving for Japan. This is actually in San Francisco, a ship going to Japan. While we have our Japanese interred here in California and different parts of the US, we also had prisoners of war. German prisoners of war and Italian prisoners of war could not be housed in Europe because there was so much damage in England and different parts of Europe. They didn't have a place to actually put them in prison. So they were brought to the US, and they had various prison camps all along the southern part of the United States. Here's a map of some of the prisoner of war camps. In our area, we had one prisoner of war camp. It was near Los Gatos Canyon, about 9 miles west of Goleta. It was established in 1944, operated until 1945. This photo was taken in September 1943. It's probably known as the Edwards Ranch more commonly. Now, all of the camps, PLW camps here in our area, their main entry point would have been Camp Cook, which is now known as Vandenberg Air Force Base. Now, what did the prisoners do while they were here? Well, most of them picked a lot of the crops. During World War II, all the soldiers and all the people were gone to war, so they had no one to pick our crops. We had the lemons, we had oranges, we had apples, all the different fruit crops and vegetables that needed to be picked in the field. We had no one to pick them. So the prisoners of war were used to actually pick the fruit that we had here. Also during this time, we also had a program called the Bracero program, where people from Mexico were brought in to actually pick the fruit as well, because all of our soldiers and people who would be working these crops were gone to war. It should be noted that the Germans, they were very, I guess they were kind of surprised at who was telling them how to pick the crops. Since most of the Mexicans were the ones directing them, they were told by a brown person to tell them to pick the crops. They never thought that would ever happen to them. Here's what remains of that one camp near Goleta. It's just south of El Capitan off the 101. If you look towards the ocean, you'll see a platform there. It's a wooden platform where a water tower would have been located. Now it's kind of different here. Here in the US, the PLW camps, the soldiers, or not soldiers, the German soldiers and prisoners of war and Italian soldiers were allowed to come into town supervised. One place they located was Mom's Italian Village. This is an Italian restaurant located on 410 East Coda Street. It was owned by Frank Signor. Now the soldiers, the prisoner of war soldiers that were staying here, some of them came back to stay with us. Ortwin Holt, a German PLW, and other prisoners, they came in through Camp Cook. You can see the images here. The clothing that the men wore said POW on the pants, so that way if they were to escape, they could tell who they actually were. Now, Mr. Holt, he was surrendered in August 1944 and brought to the PLW camp in 1946. The one he actually stayed at different ones. He came in through Camp Cook and then stayed at the Satakoy camp, which is in Ventura. He eventually returned back to Germany, but he didn't want to stay there. He saw that Germany was very different, so he wanted to return back to the US. He couldn't come directly there, so he came via Canada. He married an Austrian woman, and then he had a son named Eugene. He eventually arrived in Goleta in 1960, became a US citizen in 1965. He graduated from UCSB as an engineer and worked for Battelle company. He was involved in the Boy Scouts, the Order of Arrow, and he at one time returned to Camp Cook because his son was in ROTC. It was very different for him to come back during that time. However, he settled in Santa Barbara in Carpinteria in 1977, and he ran a laundry in his retirement years off of Milpas Street. Now, after the war, there were many things that had changed, and the soldiers that were coming back from the war, the US soldiers, they needed a place to live as they were leaving the service. So our area became a booming town for housing for them. So where did they move to? So here's a picture of the Mesa Oil Fields. This is before World War II. A lot of oil derricks. However, this was destined to be housing for our soldiers that came back from the war. Here's what it looked like during 1946. They started to build housing for the soldiers and on the Mesa there. And here's what the Mesa looks like today. Let me go back to my screen here. So I hope you learned a little bit. There's so many different topics that were covered there. Each one of them could be a research project on its own. We have the Gled Hill Library here that has some of the images and photographs that I shared today. We also have additional research that you can look at from that time period. Information on the different clubs and groups that helped soldiers, pictures of things that they did during that time frame while they were visiting here in Santa Barbara. We have a lot of research availability in our library, so at some time in the future, you can come in and do that research. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm available for questions in the future.